Actually, no. I just got to check something. Paul, can you hear me now on the phone? I'm talking to you. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's good. All right, thank you.
Can you hear me? This is a test of the emergency broadcast system.
I don't know if there's light out there, though. Should be more. Somebody's cranking it up for you. Is that the final light?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Director of the Division of International Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, which is the fourth in the new series on terrorism and homeland security that is being jointly sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Center, the RAND Corporation, and the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series. The Wilson Center is delighted to be partnering with these distinguished organizations in this seminar series. The aim of the series is to stimulate informed discussion and debate on the problem of terrorism and the most effective means to address it. The meetings seek to provide a forum in which experts from a range of professional backgrounds can meet on a regular basis to hear presentations by preeminent international experts on topical issues and to exchange views and information. Today we are very fortunate to have with us a preeminent expert on terrorism and Al-Qaeda in particular, Peter Bergen. I'd like to thank Bruce Hoffman, who heads the Washington office of the RAND Corporation and who's my co-chair in this series, for his leadership in conceiving this series and bringing it to fruition. I'd also like to offer a special word of thanks to the Army, and specifically to Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, who's here with us today, who heads the Army's Eisenhower National Security Series, for his support of this seminar series. I'd also like to acknowledge Jim Craig and Major Jim Craig and Bill Engerman of MPRI, who are here with us today. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the Army's Dwight D. Eisenhower National Security Series seeks to explore new ways to employ more effectively our nation's capabilities to meet the range of security challenges facing the country in this century. The series is a full year of programs and activities and culminates annually in its Dwight D. Eisenhower National Security Conference, which was held in mid-September here in the Ronald Reagan Building. So it's my pleasure now to turn the floor over to Bruce Hoffman, the co-chair of this series, who will introduce today's speaker and provide a word of context about the topic.
Thank you, Rob. Let me extend my welcome as well. It's always a pleasure to introduce someone who actually needs no introduction, because there are very few people like that. And Peter Bergen is indeed one of them. A graduate of New College, Oxford, where he received an MA in Modern History, a longtime journalist and producer for CNN. Peter's biography or curriculum vitae is really distinguished by, I think, two key elements. One is that he's, in fact, one of a handful of Western journalists that has had the opportunity to meet and to interview Osama bin Laden. Peter did that in 1998? 1997. So that was one distinguishing characteristic. The other one is that at a time, especially when we search for people who connected all the dots and got it right before 9/11, I think Peter can genuinely claim credit to be also being one of those handful of persons. Peter completed his magisterial work, Holy War, Inc., in August 2001. Is that right? We had lunch then, I remember. He just finished it, so a month before the attacks, and indeed in the years before 9/11, Peter had recognized the emergence of bin Laden, the movement he had fashioned, and its consequences for both international security and the security of our own nation. So, Peter, we're delighted to have you. We look forward to hearing what you have to say on Al-Qaeda 2.0.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Bruce. I'm going to cover basically 8 topics, so I'm going to try and speak rather quickly to get them out of the way. The 8 topics are the following. One is the seemingly simple question about what actually happened on 9/11. Another is the question, what is Al-Qaeda? Another looks at the question of Al-Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction. Also look at the hunt for bin Laden, how it's going. Maybe also discuss a little bit how bin Laden might see the world today. Discuss a little bit about the effect the Iraq War has had on the war on terrorism. Talk a little bit about what's going on in Afghanistan, and make some future predictions about what Al-Qaeda might do. So, first of all, what happened on 9/11? That seems like a very simple question, but actually I think there are some kind of complicated potential answers. And I think there are probably, let's say 5, 6, 7 theories that have been advanced about what happened on 9/11. They range from the kind of patently ludicrous to the reasonably possible. The 40% of Americans continue to believe that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. That kind of conspiracy theory has its it's a very common view in the Middle East that the Jews were behind 9/11. So there are a number of theories that are widely believed that, of course, are erroneous. And then we know all about the government failures. The 9/11 Commission is meeting right now, which aided Al-Qaeda in its efforts to attack the United States. But I think in terms of sort of looking at some wider intellectual theories about what happened on 9/11 that might have some truth, one, of course, is the clash of civilizations. Was 9/11 really about a clash of civilizations? I think the answer to that is probably not. The biggest fan of Huntington's clash of civilizations theory is Osama bin Laden himself. When Al Jazeera interviewed bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks, an interview they didn't air, at one point they had said it wasn't newsworthy, which is a sort of inexplicable, given the fact that if he'd read the phone book at the time, it would have been a newsworthy interview. But anyway, they never aired the interview. It was aired by CNN some months later. And in that interview, Taizira Looney, the Al Jazeera correspondent, asked bin Laden, what do you think about the clash of civilizations? And bin Laden said, yes, of course there's a clash of civilizations. The Jews and the Christians have been dragging us into believing there isn't. And we're hoping to provoke it. And of course the reason they're hoping to provoke it is that in bin Laden's view and people of his ilk, the clash of civilizations is not only inevitable, but they are going to win it. But are we really in a clash of civilizations? I don't think we are. I mean, Jim Woolsey has famously said that we're in the middle of World War IV. I don't think we're in World War IV at all. If we were, there are 1.2 billion Muslims in the world. If we were really in a clash of civilizations, we wouldn't be sitting in this room having this discussion. We would be in a very different kind of a war than we are in right now. Another theory about what happened on 9/11 is that a wider sort of intellectual view, as it were, is that it was sort of a last gasp of a political movement that's sort of desperate. In 1992, Olivier Roy, a French academic, wrote a book called The Failure of Political Islam. It was, in a way, quite visionary, perhaps wrong, but certainly visionary, saying that wherever political Islam has come to power, it's been a disaster, whether in Iran, Sudan under Tarabi, looking forward from 92, obviously the Taliban in Afghanistan, because political Islam, just saying the Quran is our constitution doesn't really get the roads paved or the telephones working. And so in this view, which Jill Keppel, I think, to some degree is built on, 9/11 was the last gasp of this desperate movement of political Islam. And in a sense, this wasn't a sign of, this was more a sign of desperation than a sign of things to come. Another view about what happened on 9/11 is, I think, and probably the most accurate, is the essay written by Michael Scott Doran in Foreign Affairs in November 2001, in which was entitled Somebody Else's Civil War. And by the way, when I go through these theories, this is not sort of idle exercise. I think it's important if we can actually explain what really happened on 9/11, why we were attacked. That will explain who the enemy is and how we might deal with them. Because I think if our analysis is wrong from an intellectual point of view, everything else will then follow will also be wrong. For instance, if we really believe Saddam is involved, we might go to war in Iraq. Or if we really believe other kinds of erroneous theories, we are going to do things that are wrong. So the Michael Scott Doran theory is entitled Somebody Else's Civil War, simply said that we were collateral damage in somebody else's civil war, which is, I think, true. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden made a analysis that attacking the so-called near enemy, the governments of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, wasn't yielding any results in their long-term objective of overthrowing these governments, and it would be better to attack the so-called far enemy, the client, the patron of these states, the United States, in an effort to destabilize and eventually bring down the the fall of both the Egyptian regime and the Saudi regime. And, to some degree, that's not a bad analysis, and to some degree, it worked. I mean, the fact that the 15 of the hijackers were Saudi, obviously the marriage of convenience between the United States and Saudi Arabia is in a huge amount of, has a lot of problems right now. So I think a final point I'd make in terms of an intellectual analysis is that, in my view, bin Laden is a rational political actor. And, these are strategic thinkers, and they actually have a plan. Sandy Berger cleverly said that the real twin towers are Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And if you're looking at it from bin Laden's point of view, how is it going in Saudi Arabia? People have been predicting the fall of the House of Saud for decades now. But I would submit that right now that's a lot more likely than it was at any time in the recent past. When you've got average real income dropping from $25,000 a year to $8,000 a year, when you have half the population under the age of 15, when you have open street demonstrations for the first time in history in the streets of Riyadh, when you have bombs going off on a regular basis, when you've jacked up the price of oil and forced foreign oil workers to leave, you're beginning to have something of a strategic success. The other twin tower, Pakistan, is also not looking so bad if you're looking at it from Osama bin Laden's perspective. Islamist parties broadly sympathetic to bin Laden now dominate the northwest frontier province and Baluchistan, the two provinces that actually now contain most of the members of Al-Qaeda who fled Afghanistan. General Musharraf just survived back in late 2003, two very serious assassination attempts. Military dictatorships don't tend to have very good succession plans. If Musharraf goes, who follows him? I'm not saying that if Musharraf goes for some reasons that Pakistan will suddenly become a bin Laden-style state, but it's a reasonable, a 5% possibility, which is probably a possibility that is already too high. So looked at from bin Laden's perspective, was 9/11 success? Well, it certainly didn't spark a clash of civilizations. One of the striking things after the 9/11 attacks, if you look at the pro-bin Laden demonstrations around the world, in places like Karachi and Jakarta, which are both cities of 15 million people, the pro-bin Laden demonstrations were very small, maybe 30,000 people in both cities. As you know, the Afghan war was the first time that NATO invoked Article 5, the right to sort of mutual self-defense. It was a very wide, internationally regarded as a just war. Now, going to this question of demonstrations, look at what happened in the run-up to the Iraq War. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the demonstrations in Karachi and Jakarta were hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 1 million, of people protesting the oncoming Iraq War. And a very important thing happened from a sort of theological perspective, which is Fadlallah, who's a leader, the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, condemned the 9/11 attacks, as did the rector of Al-Azhar University, which to the extent that Sunni Islam has a Vatican, that is it. At the same time they condemned the 9/11 attacks, when the Iraq War happened, they both called for a kind of classic defensive jihad. And this is not a kind of arcane matter of Islamic theology. A defensive jihad, as you know, the Quran is full of injunctions about war, defensive and offensive, but most Muslims agree on the defensive verses, and when you have serious leading figures in the Islamic world calling for this kind of defensive jihad, this is a big problem. So the response to the Afghan war was very different than the response to the Iraq war. And my view is the Iraq war has been a total disaster for the war on terrorism. I say that as somebody who was a lukewarm supporter of the war on the WMD grounds. I knew enough about Al-Qaeda, which I've been studying for years, that the Iraqi component of Al-Qaeda was non-existent. I mean, Al-Qaeda has stronger roots in Brooklyn than in Baghdad. I also felt that it would be unhelpful in the war on terrorism. But was mildly supportive on the nuclear weapons question. Now, I think there are three objective benchmarks that we can employ to show that the Iraq war has been a disaster for our national interests. One is polling data from around the Muslim world. Our numbers we're scoring 3% in Saudi Arabia, effectively zero favorability rating. Bin Laden scores better in Pakistan than President Bush does in this country. He gets a 65% favorability rating in Pakistan, 55% in Jordan, 45% in Morocco. All these countries are key allies in the war on terrorism. I think those numbers speak for themselves. Just being favoring bin Laden, disliking the United States doesn't make you a terrorist, but those numbers have all gone south for us in the lead up to the Iraq War or as it continues. And so we have increased the pool of people. Anti-Americanism going forward is a very serious national security issue for this country. The second objective benchmark indicating the Iraq War is not good for our national security interests is political election results in the Muslim world. Islamist parties broadly sympathetic to Al-Qaeda's agenda in Bahrain, Morocco, Kuwait, Pakistan, in the Indonesian parliamentary elections, Islamist parties have done reasonably well, either in the run-up to the war or during the war. And the third objective benchmark is, of course, terrorism. When the State Department revised its flawed terrorism figures, which first seemed to indicate that this was the most successful war in the year, and most successful 2003 was the best year we've had in 20 years in terms of terrorism. When they were re-revised, it's been the worst year for significant terrorist acts since 1982. And I suspect when the figures come out for 2004, the trend will be the same. So the Iraq War, by these objective benchmarks, has not helped us, and I think we can also make a reasonably accurate prediction that whether the war ends tomorrow or 10 years from now, we have a huge disposal problem. What has happened in Iraq reminds me of some of the things that happened in the Afghan war. Obviously, there's a huge amount of differences. You know, we're not killing 1 million Iraqis as the Soviets did in Afghanistan. The wars are very, very different in many, many respects. But they have one important similarity, and what's happening in Iraq is happening at warp speed. Bin Laden didn't fight at the Battle of Janji in Afghanistan until 1987, 7 years into the war. Foreign fighters began arriving in Iraq before the war even began. Even though their numbers may not be small, 1,500, 2,000 at the max, they are force multipliers more likely to do suicide attacks. And I have a suspicion that the Iraqi jihadists, unlike the Afghan jihadists in the Soviet war, will become involved in terrorism when the war is when war is over. The Afghans were culturally very different from the Arabs who came to fight in the Afghan war. Afghans did not become involved in terrorist movements once the war was finished. They remained in Afghanistan. I suspect that may not be true of the Iraqis. We're going to have a huge disposal problem. But if the war ends tomorrow or 10 years from now, these group of people are not going to go home to open falafel stands or coffee shops. They are going to be part of the sort of international jihadist movement. And these people are in a very different age range from people like Bin Laden, who fought in Afghanistan, who's now 48. People who are now fighting in Iraq are in their early 20s. So I think the Iraq war is obviously not being particularly helpful for the broader war on terrorism. Why haven't we found Bin Laden? Why might it be important? Yesterday, we just had the 28th videotape or audio tape from Ayman al-Zawahiri or Bin Laden since 9/11. Just marinate on that number for 1 second. 28 videotapes and audio tapes by the leaders of Al-Qaeda. Now, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to recognize that the chain of custody of these audio tapes and videotapes is the one surefire method. You can find them. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on our national security. Why can't we stake out the Al Jazeera Bureau in Pakistan? It was an entirely predictable event that Bin Laden would release a videotape or an audio tape in the run-up to the American election, which he did. And that tape went to the Al Jazeera bureau chief in Islamabad. Again, a predictable event. There is a kind of conventional wisdom. It doesn't matter if we don't find Bin Laden or he's sort of out of it or Ayman al-Zawahiri's out of it. I think that conventional wisdom is completely wrong for the following two reasons. First of all, via these audio tapes and videotapes, Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri don't need to be in command and control of Al-Qaeda anymore. They are in command and control. Every 6 weeks they release, on average, one of these tapes with instructions. Sometimes the instructions are kill President Musharraf. That happened in December 2003, maybe October 2003. Within 2 months, two very serious assassination attempts against Musharraf. That tape came from Ayman al-Zawahiri. Sometimes the tape says attack members of the coalition in Iraq, as Bin Laden did shortly before the attacks on the British bank and consulate in Turkey, the attack on the Italian police barracks in Nasiriyah, and of course Madrid. So via the meeting, these videotapes and audio tapes, Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri energized their base, told them what to do. There are no hidden messages. There never have been. There are always overt messages: kill Americans, kill Westerners, kill Jews. And they remain in the game. Why has it been so hard to find them? Part of it is the problem of finding one person. You know, the Israelis spent 15 years trying to find Eichmann after the Holocaust. We spent 5 years trying to find Eric Rudolph after the Atlanta Centennial Park bombing in '96 during the Olympics. People say the Whitey Bulger is still missing from Boston. I mean, again and again, if one person with a sort of support network is trying to give you the slip, Now take that problem then an order of magnitude up, and in the area where bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri are likely to be, in somewhere in Pakistan probably. Yesterday or just this weekend, the Pakistanis said that they're withdrawing troops from southern Waziristan, the troops that were looking for bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, which I actually think is a good thing because they didn't find anybody. Nobody is hiding. We haven't found a single person in the tribal areas of any significance in Al-Qaeda since 9/11. All the senior Al-Qaeda leaders that have been found in Pakistan have been found in cities. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Rawalpindi, Ramzi bin al-Shib in Karachi, Abdul Rahman's son in Quetta, this guy Gilani recently in Gujarat, again and again, city after city. And that kind of makes sense. Think about the videotape we just saw from bin Laden. There isn't electricity in the tribal areas in most cases. There certainly aren't lots of people with video cameras, and there's certainly not internet connections and newspapers. If you look at the full text of bin Laden's statement in that videotape, which was published by Al Jazeera on its website, it's very interesting because it talks about the supplemental funding for the Afghan and Iraq war, which is a sort of, bin Laden's like a policy wonk. How many Americans even know about the $70 billion? And also that's a very recent kind of number. This suggests to me a kind of close attention to the media, he mentioned also, interesting enough, a speech that somebody had given at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, which is sort of like the Council on Foreign Relations here, a very relatively obscure kind of thing to be knowing about in Afghanistan and to be kind of keeping abreast of these kinds of speeches. Again, an indication to me that he's not sitting in some foxhole in the tribal areas, but they might be in some sort of small town with access to the internet. If not, another theory I have that might be worth exploring is that he could well be in Kashmir. Pakistani Kashmir, so-called Azad Kashmir, free Kashmir, was off limits to outsiders long before 9/11. I visited there after the Indian Airlines hijacking in December of '99, when it was hijacked by a group of Kashmiri militants, and it was very difficult to go to then. At this point, it's basically impossible. The Kashmiri militant groups and Al-Qaeda have essentially morphed, I think, into really sort of the same organization. That trend that was there before 9/11, Harakat al-Mujahideen, one of the big groups, shared training camps of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Jaish Mohammed was subsidized by bin Laden. Jaish Mohammed was the group that, along with Al-Qaeda, kidnapped and murdered Danny Pearl. That trend has accelerated. I think if you look at some of the what's happening in Pakistan, the Kashmiri militant groups, which are, in many cases popular. Lashkar-e-Toiba, for instance, has 2,200 officers in Pakistan. When it has its annual meeting, hundreds of thousands of people show up. So these groups are genuinely popular. Musharraf has tried to crack down on them, but those crackdowns come and go in ebbs and flows. The leader of Jaish Mohammed, a guy called Maulana Raza, is one day he's under house arrest, the other day he isn't, and suddenly he's out. So these groups can operate with some impunity. They are closely allied to Al-Qaeda, and it's not impossible to think that they would be sheltering bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, other members of Al-Qaeda. Other reasons that we can't find bin Laden, he's not making amateur errors. Pablo Escobar was yakking it up on his cell phone with his son for 3 minutes too long when a group of Colombian special forces and aided by the CIA found him in Medellin. But Pablo Escobar was operating in only one city in Colombia, and people knew he was there. We don't really know where bin Laden was. Senator Kerry in the campaign said that we missed an opportunity to get bin Laden at Tora Bora, which is factually true. I can't prove it to you 100%, but bin Laden was almost certainly at the Battle of Tora Bora. There are 3 reasons that I can say that is the case. First of all, eyewitnesses' accounts say that bin Laden was there. I've interviewed people who said bin Laden was there. People like bin Laden's personal chef, people like a Saudi financier who was bringing money into Tora Bora. Secondly, go back and look at what was being said about the radio transmissions out of Tora Bora at the time. In December of 2001, there were indications that bin Laden was there at the Battle of Tora Bora. Also, bin Laden himself in 2003, when this was a subject of no interest, released an audio tape recounting his experiences at the Battle of Tora Bora. Ayman al-Zawahiri, when he released his autobiography, made it clear that he'd written part of it at the Battle of Tora Bora. So I think there was strong evidence that bin Laden was at the Battle of Tora Bora, an area of several dozen square miles. Now we think he might be in the Northwest Frontier Province, which is like saying, I think he might be in Virginia. It's an area of 40,000 square miles. So he's not making amateur errors. He's in an area which is quite large. cash rewards haven't worked. Cash rewards have tended to be quite successful in finding terrorists. Ramzi Youssef, the bomber, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center attack, was found in Pakistan because of a cash reward. Miram al-Kansi, the guy who shot up the CIA headquarters back in '93, was found because of cash reward. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, his arrest may have had something to do with the cash reward. But bin Laden has had a $5 million cash reward since '99, no takers. It went up to $25 million after 9/11. It's now $50 million. We're spending $1 billion every 3 days in Iraq. Why not just make it $1 billion and see if it shakes anything out of the trees? But it's so the people in the bin Laden's immediate circle are not motivated by money. We also don't have a mole within the group. The 9/11 report was incredibly instructive about the number of people who actually knew what was going to happen on 9/11. Well, maybe 9 or 10 people, and we could name them. The number of people who actually knew where the planes were going, what their targets was, what day it was very limited. One of the most striking things about that videotape that was found of bin Laden hanging out with a sort of toadying Saudi supporter after 9/11 was he turns to Sulaiman Abu Raid, the group spokesman, and says, we didn't even include him in about 9/11. So the point is that the number of people who would actually know what bin Laden is, I think, is similar to the number of people who would have known what was going to happen on 9/11. You're talking about a dozen people. So there's no mole within that group. Signals intelligence isn't working. Money isn't working. Eventually, bin Laden will make a dumb mistake, and luck obviously plays an important role in life, and he will be found. What happens when he's found? Do you want to capture him? Do you want to kill him? Who kills him? These are not trivial questions. After all, an American killing bin Laden would not, I don't think, would be very useful. I think the best thing we could do is capture him. I mean, and we should do the Saddam Hussein treatment, check him for headlights. Nothing did more to puncture Saddam's sort of mythic persona than those pictures, and the same would be true of bin Laden. And then where would you try him? Obviously not in the Southern District of New York. The crimes of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden have spanned many countries and continents. There's a very strong, international tribunal could be put up, maybe a cell next to Milosevic in The Hague. But unfortunately, I think the capturing option is unlikely. He has said that he will martyr himself in this struggle. Bin Laden is one of the people who says what he's going to do, and I think taking him at face value is incredibly useful. Imagine for a minute the Japanese High Command started in 1937 warning us repeatedly that we were going to be attacked, how the events of Pearl Harbor would play out on the morning of December 8th, 1941 in a different way. Well, bin Laden repeatedly warned us that he was planning to attack us, and we never took him seriously. And he's repeatedly said, I'm willing to martyr myself in this struggle. And I think he will. What will happen if he dies in the struggle? I think in the short term it would trigger anti-American attacks around the world. In the medium term it would be a huge, would have a big impact on Al-Qaeda, the formal organization, which after all is a creation of bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. I'm a believer in the sort of great man theory of history in the sense that it's very hard to imagine the Holocaust without Hitler or the French arriving at Moscow in 1812 without Napoleon. And it's very hard to imagine Al-Qaeda without Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden. It was great finding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. That definitely averted lots of terrorist attacks. But it's 20 times more important to find bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. They created this thing, and it is really there. It's very rare that people actually change history. I think it's true that bin Laden changed history. And I think that in the medium term, taking him out of it would be very damaging to Al-Qaeda, the organization. In the longer term, it would probably help his ideas. It's an obvious thing to say that Al-Qaeda, the organization, is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, the organization, is morphed into Al-Qaeda, a sort of wider ideological movement. If you think about Saeed Qutb, who was a Lenin in this movement, he was an obscure Egyptian writer when he was executed in 1966 by Sadat. In death, in martyrdom, his ideas took on a much larger resonance. That would be, I think, true of bin Laden's ideas. In death, I think they would take on a much larger resonance. What are bin Laden's ideas? Well, bin Laden's ideas are kind of standard issue in the Middle East. And I can't think of any Pakistani I've met who doesn't really share most of bin Laden's ideas. The one thing that's different is his call for violence against Americans and Westerners and Jews. And I think we've done a very poor job. The Cold War was won not just with battle tanks in the fields of Germany, but with a rather sophisticated, multi-pronged approach, funding Christian democratic parties in Europe, funding magazines opposed to communism, finding liberals opposed to communism, covertly supporting them, overtly supporting whatever worked. And if we are in a sort of broader ideological struggle, which I think is what we are in, I don't think we take bin Laden's ideas seriously enough on some levels. It's like these ideas aren't important. I mean, just because we disagree with them doesn't mean they aren't significant. And I think that we need, in a way, we should start taking the ideas more seriously if we're interested in defeating them. After all, the Soviet Union collapsed. It imploded. We defeated it militarily on some levels, but also on a lot of other levels. People stopped believing it. You don't die for beliefs you don't believe in. And I think we need to start thinking about that very carefully. And so far, I don't think there's been a lot of thought about it. But who are the people around the world who could be helpful to us? Obviously, the Iraq War has made it more difficult for us on some levels, but the Iraq War will not go on forever, and this ideological struggle is going to go on much longer than the Iraq War. So we need to be thinking, in longer term, 20, 30, 40 years, about how it is that we will ideologically defeat this. And now let me throw up some ideas. First of all, I think we've done a very, very poor propaganda job. I don't mean by that, Al-Qaeda television's only got $63 million a year, which is a joke. I mean, I work at CNN. I know how much television costs. You don't start a television network with $63 million. It's a joke. But I need something more profound. I think that, for instance, we could have said, long before 9/11 happened, that bin Laden had killed more Muslims than Americans. We could have said that publicly. The Kenya and Tanzania bombings certainly killed more Muslims than Americans. Kenya and Tanzania are 30% Muslim countries. Only 12 Americans died in it. We lost a propaganda opportunity. We could have said, when the Trade Center was attacked, that a disproportionately large number. I don't think anybody's ever actually found out how many Muslims died in the World Trade Center. Maybe this is an absurd idea, but I think it would be interesting to know. I would think you would find it would be disproportionately high numbers of tourists and visitors and businessmen who happened to be there that day. When Paul Johnson was beheaded, President Bush and Vice President Cheney both very appropriately said that this was a horrendous crime. But I think they also should have said that the Quran doesn't countenance this stuff. And maybe again this is a terrible idea, but I think it's something that we should be thinking about. Let me conclude with three quick things. Am I doing okay on time? Al-Qaeda and WMD, Afghanistan, and predictions about Al-Qaeda in the future. Al-Qaeda and WMD, one of the great things about the war in Afghanistan is that we disrupted the weapons of mass destruction program. And it was an amateur effort, but it was a serious effort. And they were smart enough to know that they didn't know certain things when they started talking to people who did. And instead of talking to Iraqi nuclear scientists who never actually made an atomic weapon, they talked to Pakistani nuclear scientists who actually successfully had done so. And as you know, they met with two senior nuclear scientists, and they weren't talking about gardening; they were talking about nuclear weapons. They were even contemplating uranium mining in Afghanistan. Uranium is natural to Afghanistan. They had a sort of amateur chem bio research program. We disrupted that, and that was very useful. But they remain, I think, intensely interested in this. And I think that we've seen in London some evidence of people discussing or perhaps being interested in deploying a radiological weapon. We don't know what the charges against Jose Padilla is exactly, but maybe he was interested in deploying a radiological weapon in this country. Radiological weapons, as I'm sure you know, are not that easy, that difficult to make. I think that I could make them, or most people in this room, without much of a scientific background. The sources for this material are ubiquitous: medical waste, all sorts of industrial processes. I think it's reasonable to assume that we will have a radiological bomb go off in a Western city in the next 5-10 years. It's surprising to me that it hasn't happened. Nuclear weapons is a whole other, it's much harder, but a gun-type nuclear device is not a particularly difficult scientific problem. The problem is getting the material. Certainly, as we saw from the anthrax attacks, which, by the way, remain spectacularly unsolved, and I don't know why people aren't writing about this. We still haven't found the anthrax attacker, but clearly these kinds of things will be very disruptive and remain a possibility. I think in terms of the threat from inside to this country, I'm not really very concerned about sleeper cells in this country. If there are sleeper cells, they're really staying very, very sleepy because they haven't done anything. I mean, the Iraq War would have been a major opportunity for them. The election, when dogs don't bark at a certain point, perhaps there are no dogs. And if you look at the cases that have been done in this country, Lackawanna, Oregon, Detroit, again, these cases are Lackawanna, the guys who went to fight with the Taliban, that seems like a post facto criminalization of bad judgment, not really a terrorist series. By the way, there have only been 2 terrorist cases in the United States since 9/11. One of them was Richard Reed, and the other one was a guy, Farris, the Ohio trucker, who thought that he could actually cut through the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge. I don't know if you've seen the cables, but they're not easy to cut through. So the reason I say all that is that it doesn't seem to me, based on the cases we've seen and the lack of activity we've seen, that there are Al-Qaeda sleeper cells. And go back to the 9/11 report, the 19 hijackers came here, anybody who helped them inadvertently. There was no support structure. And if you look at all the attacks that have either happened in the United States or have been thwarted, they've all come from outside. The 9/11 attack itself, Richard Reed, the British Jamaican, Al Brittany, the guy who was just arrested in London, who was casing the financial institutions in New York and New Jersey, and Osama, the guy who tried to blow up LAX airport over Christmas of 1999. And the reason I say all that, the threat is not internally, the threat is externally, the threat is probably from Europe. We saw with the Van Gogh assassination, the Al Brittany arrest in London, that there was a very serious problem in Europe. And I think, looking to some future trends, Europe has a massive demographic problem, which is they're not reproducing. Europeans are simply, Italians are going to go out of business shortly. In fact, I don't know if this is true, but it's a brilliant statistic if it is. If present demographic trends continue, the population of Yemen will be larger than Russia in 2050. Anyway, that may be an exaggeration, but it's I think illustrative of a much larger problem, which is Europeans are simply not reproducing, and they've got a problem about supporting their aging populations. The only way they can really do this, unless they reinvent economics, is to bring more immigrants into their countries. And so the 20 million immigrants that exist in Europe are going to be supplemented very rapidly over time. They have higher birth rates, and there's going to be more immigrants coming in. And unlike, I think, the immigrants to this country, and I say this as somebody who grew up in Britain, I think there's a lot more racism. And this is not a class thing in Europe. It's a racial problem. If you look at the Omar Sheikhs of the world, the guy who was the LSE graduate who kidnapped Danny Pearl, he wasn't suffering any kind of class bias, but he may well have felt some sort of racial discrimination in Britain. And I think the Pakistanis in Britain, the Algerians in France, the Moroccans in Holland and also in Belgium, these kinds, I think there is a problem of alienation. And a subject that I and Bruce, Dr. Hoffman and I are very interested in is the Mike's Place bombing in Tel Aviv back in April of 2003. Here are 2 British middle-class guys, one from a graduate of the LSE, which seems to be more successful than the madrasas in terms of churning out terrorist graduates, but they do a suicide attack in an Israeli jazz club, and they kill them. One of them kills himself and kills 3 other people. Now, if a British middle-class guy can blow himself up in an Israeli jazz club, he certainly can do it inside the United States. After all, Israel seems to be more concerned about its security than even we are. And I think that's the trend going forward that one really has to be very concerned about. Second, converts, this guy Al Brittany, also known as Al Hindi, was actually a convert from Hinduism to Islam. He was the guy arrested in August casing the financial institutions inside the United States. So it's second generation, it's converts, and it's people probably coming from Europe. So that's one trend I'm concerned about going forward. A few other predictive, the Hilton Hotel attack in Taba in Egypt was a sort of threefer for Al-Qaeda. First, for a start, it killed a lot of Israelis and Jews. Secondly, it attacked tourism. Disrupting the global economy is very high on the agenda right now. Bin Laden, in the most recent videotape, pointed out that 9/11 was a leverage investment of all time. For every dollar they spent, it cost us $1 million. $500,000 they spent cost us $500 million by conservative estimates. And that was an unexpected lesson they drew from the 9/11 events. And as a matter of policy, a year after 9/11, Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri both released audio tapes saying, let's attack Western economies. After that, there was the attack on the Bali disco, the attack on Lindbergh, the French oil tanker in Yemen. And that's a trend that's increased. They now have sort of strategic success of actually jacking up the price of oil in real terms. There is a debate about how much that there is, but there is a so-called fear premium on the price of oil that is an Al-Qaeda effort to really change the price of oil. They've always thought that oil was undervalued, that we were paying too little for it. That's a constant bin Laden theme, and this is a new development. And it's a development that will continue, attacking oil installations in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, oil workers, etc. So attacking the world economy, attacking oil installations, attacking tourist sites, also attacking famous Western brand names. There have been attacks on Sheraton hotels in both Jakarta and Baghdad, also a attack on a Sheraton hotel in Karachi, a JW Marriott in Jakarta, pardon me, Shell gas stations in Karachi, which didn't get a lot of attention because no one was killed. McDonald's, which used to be the subject of leftist terrorism, is now the subject of Islamist terrorism. So Western brand names, if you're running a hotel, an American hotel company around the world, you have to be very concerned. And going back to Taba, of course, that was a Hilton hotel, so that was another useful thing for the... again, Taba was interesting because there was a ceasefire in Egypt that going back to '97, which is obviously now expired. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Egypt. Attacking Jews and Israelis. It was always puzzling to me that Al-Qaeda, which after all was founded to attack Crusaders and Jews, never attacked Jewish or Israeli targets until after 9/11. I think I have one possible explanation for that, which is they really think the Pentagon is entirely staffed by Jews, and the Trade Center as well, so that really was an attack on a Jewish target if you get inside their sort of cosmology of the world. But they never attacked a real Jewish or Israeli target until they kidnapped and murdered Danny Pearl. That trend has now accelerated very rapidly. Attacks on the Casablanca synagogue, attacks on the Casablanca Jewish cemetery, attacks on 2 synagogues in Istanbul, an attack on a Tunisian synagogue killing German tourists, the attack on the Israeli-owned hotel in Mombasa, the attempt to bring down the Israeli passenger jet, also in Mombasa, and of course the attack in Egypt just recently. Couple of other quick things. Obviously, the extent that Al-Qaeda, as you know, means the base. If they lost their base in Afghanistan, to the extent they have a new base, it's obviously on the internet. Paul Johnson's beheading was posted to the internet within about 24 hours of it happening. In a sense, do they really need a geographical base right now? And I'm going to end on an optimistic note, having said so many pessimistic things. I was in Afghanistan during the elections. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times two weeks before they were happening, saying that I thought it was going to be a success, for which the first time in my life I got a lot of hate mail, sort of you're a Bush lover, etc., etc. And of course, it was not my intention really to make a political statement of any kind, but I've been visiting Afghanistan since '93. I was there during the Civil War. I was there under the Taliban. And so I have a sense of how things have changed, and I think there are a lot of great grounds to be very optimistic in Afghanistan. President Karzai faced a slate of 17 other candidates and got 55%, which is better than President Bush did against one candidate in this country. And the Taliban was not able to disrupt the election at all. The Taliban, I think, as a political military force, are largely spent. When you go to Kabul or other cities around the country, the roads are being repaved. Rents in Kabul are sky high. There is construction everywhere, and there's a lot of optimism. And also, Americans are genuinely loved in Afghanistan. The one thing Afghans do not want to happen is for us to leave. They felt very betrayed when we closed our embassy there back in 1989 after the end of the Soviet war. And so the trends in Afghanistan are quite favorable. And if you think about the democratic domino effect, which is one of the arguments of the Iraq War, which seems to have failed spectacularly thus far unless things change, the democratic domino effect with Afghanistan might actually work. Afghanistan is surrounded by 4 countries: Iran, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, none of which are representative democracies, and all of whom regard Afghans as sort of one step up from Neanderthals. It must be kind of a seismic moment for them to think that the Afghans have actually done a free and fair election, which has produced a very favorable outcome for Karzai. Karzai, the Pashtuns make 45% of the population, so he must have been also getting votes from other ethnic groups. People did not vote for him only on ethnic grounds. And when I went to Gardez, which is the most conservative city in Afghanistan, the day of the election, it was very moving to see women voting. You never see women at all in this city, and saying they really were voting for change and for Karzai. So on that optimistic note.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure there are lots of questions. We have about 40 minutes, correct?
The speakers could just identify themselves, and we have a microphone in the back. Matt, if you could just circulate it as speakers. I don't think anyone can hear you, sir. Hang on 1 second. Matt, can you bring the microphone up?
My name is Diba from WRC.
Is it on?
At the bottom, no.
I can just repeat.
Want me to speak louder and do?
Go ahead.
I'll try to speak louder. My name is Diba. I'm from WRC. Question is that, as you know, there are close, at least ideological relations between Iran and Al-Qaeda. Although they have this Sunni-Shia separation, there have been many reports about Al-Qaeda elements being in Iran from different sources, especially here in the United States. My question is that, what's your analysis about the relations of Al-Qaeda and Iran?
As you probably know, Iran almost went to war against the Taliban when Al-Qaeda was basically running the country. So the relations have gone from freezing cold to, I think, sort of warmer. Saif al-Adil, who's the military commander of Al-Qaeda, is in Iran. Similarly, Abu Raid, who is the spokesman for the group, is in Iran. Mohammed al-Nasri, who is one of Ayman al-Zawahiri's number 2 guys, is in Iran. And there are others. Now, these guys are under some form of house arrest in Iran. As you know, I mean, one analysis is there are 2 governments in Iran, and one of the governments, the more hardcore, is kind of protecting these people. They are sort of on ice. There is a theory that the Riyadh attacks in 2003 were ordered by Saif al-Adil from Iran, which may be quite plausible. If you believe that theory, then the Saudis turned around to the Iranians and said, this has got to end, which it may well have done. So these guys are sort of on ice at this point, maybe to be used as bargaining chips in some future.
On that last point, do you think there's a connection between the Al-Qaeda presence in Iran and the U.S. schizophrenic approach to the MEK?
I don't know.
Could you also identify yourself before you ask the question?
My name is Ben Bergen with Analyst. You mentioned your belief that the indigenous fighters in Iraq would become more involved in the global jihad in Iran. I was just curious to hear more about the reason behind that.
Well, I think the reason for that, Afghans are culturally very different from the Arabs who were coming in. In fact, the Afghans hated the Arabs who came in, and they regarded them as, to quote Bergen, who was running the CIA station at the time, a pain in the ass. And they didn't really want them. And the Afghans don't need people to help them fight. I mean, that's one thing they do very well. And so they didn't really want the Arabs coming in. And they are culturally very different. I think that's not true of the Syrians and the Saudis and who are coming into Iraq. I think they're going to be much closer. And I can't prove this, but I think it's a reasonable assumption.
Can you comment, Mark Erloff from Homeland Security, can you comment at all on bin Laden's purported injury to his left arm?
Yes. Again, evidence that he was the Battle of Tora Bora. Bin Laden, if you go back to the tape that was released December 27, 2001, the last videotaped on-camera statement from bin Laden, he at the time he was 45. He looked like he was in his mid-70s. His whole entire left side was immobilized, which was unusual since he gestures with both hands in the course of half an hour statement. So Abdul Bari Atwan, who's the editor of Al-Quds newspaper, who has very good sources within Al-Qaeda, has told me that he was wounded at the Battle of Tora Bora. I think that makes sense. And in this videotape, December 27, 2001, bin Laden refers to his own mortality. He talks about, I'm a poor slave of God. If I die, the great jihad will continue. The most recent videotape, he made absolutely no mention of any kind of intimations of mortality. He seemed pretty comfortable. The shoulder wound seemed to have cleared up in the most recent videotape. So I think he did sustain a shoulder wound, and it's healed over time.
I understand that in this country it's called the war against terrorism, whereas in most European countries it's called the struggle against terrorism. And so we also have an American expression, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So my question is war the appropriate metaphor and strategy for dealing with Al-Qaeda, or is this more a counterintelligence problem?
I think it depends where you are in history. I mean, I think it was appropriate in Afghanistan the military campaign there was a huge success, barring the, I think, mistakes were made at the Battle of Tora Bora. But I mean, if you are interested in capturing the leaders of Al-Qaeda, they're all in Pakistan. I'm not suggesting we invade Pakistan. Clearly, that's a counterintelligence, law enforcement, approach. I mean, but these are not either-or answers. I mean, let's employ everything we have.
That's it. The building one, Woodrow Wilson said, would you care to comment on the coming election in Iraq and whether you have any optimism in regards to that?
You know, I don't think I will because I'm not an Iraq expert.
I was at a, my name is Mary Mullins, working with Mr. Quigley. I was at a forum at Georgetown of Arabic journalists, and one of the journalists was saying to the other journalists, we want democracy and freedom for the Palestinians. Why don't we want democracy and freedom for the Iraqis? And I was wondering if you could get, some of the other journalists didn't take it very well, but I was wondering if you could.
Well, I'll quote a friend of mine, Solomon Nemat, who is the bureau chief of Al-Hayat in Washington. He'll say the following. We know what the Palestinians think and we know what the Iraqis think, but we don't know what the Libyans and the Syrians think. And so the answer to your question is, yes, there is a sort of democratic thing that's happening in Palestine and Iraq that's not happening in other parts of the Middle East.
Yeah, Mark Randall, Department of Homeland Security. As it folks to the question on the struggle against Al-Qaeda or the war against Al-Qaeda, you had alluded to the propaganda war, and you haven't been doing a particularly good job. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of what the government wanted to do it right, so to speak, in your view. What additional things might they be doing to know that well?
Well, I wouldn't be running a cooking show in the middle of the Battle of Fallujah, as Al-Hura television did. So, I mean, that wasn't particularly effective propaganda. I mean, to do effective propaganda, you have to have, really have to have good news. And if we're going to compete with Al Jazeera, the good thing about it, I mean, I'm kind of agnostic about Al Jazeera. I believe in Al Jazeera, like CNN, had a monopoly, which is disappearing. There's Al Arabi and Abu Dhabi and all these other channels. But if we're going to compete in that arena, let's be serious. I just think $63 million doesn't even begin to get you the kinds of the coverage you need, the people you need. So, I mean, one component would be a much more serious amount of money, just in a simple thing about if we're going to do this television thing right. But I think a broader problem is actually thinking about what are the messages we're trying to get out there. And I can't give you an instant answer. I gave you some of the ideas I had earlier.
And you meant the first battle of Fallujah?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, not
yes, the first battle, yes.
Yes?
Nick Berry, Foreign Policy Forum. Peter, you mentioned in the context of propaganda, the last bin Laden tape, you talked a lot about bankrupting the United States, and it's part of the strategy and the falling right into his strategy. With the problem with the current account deficit, the huge budget deficits, we are probably going to have major economic difficulties in this country. Is he playing on a trend, or is it really a strategy?
I mean, yeah, I think he's sort of looking at any kind of thing he can say. I mean, obviously the tax cuts have got a lot to do with that current account deficit as much as the war on terrorism, or much more than the war on terrorism. So I don't think that's serious. I mean, I think bin Laden certainly rejoices in how much these things cost us, but I mean, I think we can afford it.
T.S. Williams, TSA. Question about more about the economic questions you brought up earlier, especially oil infrastructure. How there, with Al-Qaeda's the nexus of terrorism and the latest foreign affairs, they spoke a little about that, but it was kind of anecdotal. This will be a very lucrative target, attacking these VLCCs in the Malaysian Straits. Why are we not seeing more targeted towards that?
Well, I mean, we are seeing a lot of attacks on oil installations in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia, and attacks, broadly speaking, on anybody who's a foreign worker in Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, I think they have been successful there. Why hasn't that been extended elsewhere? You know, sometimes I think it's because they didn't have the people. You know, I think that sometimes we overestimate their strength.
Yes, to the back there.
I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a political psychologist, and I write about psychology of terrorism. So thank you very much for the work. I think it's very valuable, and I appreciate it. You just said that we should take bin Laden's messages at face value, and we should take them much more seriously. And I totally agree with you on that. And I think whenever we get a message from him, you know, people say he's threatening to attack us, and it's kind of be ready and very emotional. But if you actually read the text, his messages are very consistent, also very complex and coherent. And basically, it's very conditional. He's not saying, if you kill us, we'll kill you. Or before he say, our economic lifeline, or you could take your economic lifeline, comma, unless you stop your oppression of Muslims. So nobody reads the second half of his sentence. And under Jones Radio yesterday saying that he was maybe offering up the truth.
Yeah.
And, you know, and there's like a kind of heresy to take that seriously.
Well, I think, sorry.
Just from a political, psychological, conflict studies perspective, that it's worth doing, but there's a resistance to doing it.
I think that when I say take things seriously, I don't necessarily mean that we should respond to them. I think we just need to understand that they're meant seriously. And now, in this most recent videotape, bin Laden was offering us a truce, which in Islamic jurisprudence is what you're supposed to do before you attack somebody. I would take that somewhat seriously. I'm not saying that we should sort of change all aspects of our American foreign policy in order to, you know, to satisfy bin Laden. Obviously, that's not what I mean. But I do think that we need to attend to what he says. And if indeed this truce expires, the same truce was offered to the European countries in the coalition. That expired in July. Nothing really has happened. But it would be interesting. You know, I think that we should take this seriously. I guess this truce thing.
David Schoenberg, Washington University. How would you characterize Al-Qaeda links in sub-Saharan Africa today? And would you be willing to make any comments about the future of these activities in the next year or two?
You know, Doug Fowler's book, Blood from Stones, I thought was a really brilliant piece of investigative reporting about what Al-Qaeda was doing in Africa. And I would just point you to that because I don't really know anything about it.
Hi, gentlemen. I'm asking you, what's the relation between Al-Qaeda and
there's a sort of conventional wisdom that Al-Qaeda kind of got on the Israeli-Palestinian problem late in life, which I think is basically wrong. I mean, when we met with bin Laden in '97, United States support for Israel was either the number 2 or number 3 complaint he had after the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden's family renovated not only Mecca and Medina, but they also renovated the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem after it was burnt down in 1969 by a deranged Australian tourist. So his family's had a pretty personal interest in Jerusalem, and bin Laden has said in the past that his father was able to pray at all 3 of the holy sites of Islam in the course of one day. Obviously, he took a helicopter or plane or both. So I am suspicious of the notion they jumped on this sort of late in the game. I think that the story changed. I mean, the second Intifada happened, and that really outraged people within Al-Qaeda. If you look at the videotape they released back in the summer of 2001, a videotape I found on the internet, a 2-hour videotape that laid out, I thought, the best case that Al-Qaeda had ever made for itself. There was about 15 minutes of that kid being shot, you know, the 12-year-old kid, and wailing, and it really is a very emotional thing for them. So I think that they, while they haven't been really involved in anti-Israeli or attacks until relatively recently, I think that this conflict is very important to them. I don't know if that answers your question.
On that side of the baby, I want to ask you, can you say something about the effectiveness and the cost-risk issue of Homeland Security response to Al-Qaeda?
Not really.
All the way in the back.
My name is Shafan Laden. Sir, immediately after the 9/11 attack on the United States of America, it seemed that bin Laden and his close lieutenants were trying to portray this as a threat in the Middle East.
But now, if you look at the latest message of Al-Qaeda al-Zawahiri, statement number 2, and then the latest statement on the election in the Universities of America, they are trying to portray it as global Muslim wisdom, especially American problem. As you refer, it is not exclusively Israeli-Palestinian problem. In your opinion, what should be the reaction of the United States of America in order to limit the propaganda and psychological effects of this, at least on the minds of the Muslim youth who might be to go to Iraq here and there? Personally, I don't see anything. I just see some superficial program, but nothing substantial.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. And I mean, I think the numbers I referred to earlier indicate how much resonance these views have. You know, Bin Laden has stepped into a vacuum of legitimacy in the Muslim world. He is able to speak for parts of the Muslim world because Mubarak and the Saudis can't. I mean, they're not legitimate rulers. And I think that until we have more legitimate rulers in that part of the world, it's going to be very hard for people to sort of present themselves as alternate voices.
I think that's all fair to say. Aside from the internet and the assumptions in this case, how do you think Al-Qaeda or the resources communicating with them?
I mean, are they communicating other than these tapes and the internet? I don't think so. I mean, the internet is incredibly efficient. And in fact, one of the reasons they no longer have to do, you know, I was at talking to some journalism colleagues last night. You know, they don't need the traditional news media anymore. The internet means they can completely circumvent it. I mean, I work at CNN, so I see how this happens. You know, when obviously a lot of stuff we don't report on because, you know, some of the stuff, the beheadings is, you know, is not something that you could even begin to report on. But the stuff is all around the internet. They don't have to deal with traditional journalists. They just post it on the internet, and these sites are being constantly monitored by groups like Memory or the Site Institute or others, and are constantly going to journalists like myself or researchers like Bruce. And so I think that in the last 3 or 4 years, they've obviated any need to deal with the traditional media structure, and they have a very efficient, cheap, global distribution.
Joseph Casper, I'm your Department of Justice. How would you explain the absence of attacks within the U.S. since September 11th?
The absence of attacks within the United States, I think, as I've indicated, is I don't think they have people here. You know, that's simple. And we've obviously made it a much harder target to get in due to, and I think that we've also interrupted their ability. If you think about the 9/11 plot, the 9/11 plot, I just can't imagine that kind of thing happening again, because the 9/11 plot required money transfers from the United Arab Emirates. It required plotters in Germany, plotters in Pakistan, headquarters in Afghanistan signing off. It required people from all around the Middle East to arrive in this country, get together in all sorts of different places. I mean, it was a kind of transcontinental plot. And I think we've disrupted all the arms of that kind of plot. And that's why what we're seeing is localized attacks done by local people, like the Madrid thing. And so I think that, people are doing their jobs. And I think that the likelihood of that, at least in my mind, is very low. On the other hand, if you'd asked me on September 10th, could they attack the United States, I would have said that's just, having spent, 10 years of my life looking into this, I think that's impossible. So.
Okay. Department of Defense. Over the next 4 years, do you believe that Bashar of Pakistan will be able to intensify its fight against Al-Qaeda? Do you think at some point the U.S. is just going to go without coordinating the West?
Well, I think, Musharraf has now withdrawn these troops to Waziristan, which I think is very interesting on the weekend. Because after all, that was where the big leaders of Al-Qaeda were supposed to be. I wasn't ever convinced that was the case. But why did he withdraw them is an interesting question. I mean, conspiracists might say that he didn't really need them anymore now that the U.S. election is over. And to some degree, this is good for business for the Pakistanis. And I'm not saying this about General Musharraf himself. I think General Musharraf is personally determined to wipe out Al-Qaeda. After suffering 2 very serious assassination attempts. But the Pakistanis, it goes in ebbs and flows. I mentioned with the Kashmiri militant groups that the policy is all over the place. So, and particularly if Al-Qaeda, and if my theory that Al-Qaeda and the Kashmiri militant groups have to some degree morphed, it becomes much, much harder for whether it's Musharraf or whoever succeeds him.
How is U.S. policy playing out in terms of short-term and long-term U.S. security and political interest in terms of Pakistan policy supporting Musharraf after 9/11? How is it playing out in short and long?
In the United States, I mean, how I don't quite.
Point of view of the United States.
Well, I mean, I think Musharraf was, essentially given a set of marching orders immediately after 9/11 by Armitage, which he basically said, "I'm going to sign on to." And I think Musharraf is about as good as it gets. Benazir did not serve our country very well, nor did Nawaz. And General Musharraf, I'm a big fan of. I think he shot himself in the foot with two things that he's done. One was to have a referendum on what a great guy he is. He's a military dictator. You don't really need to do that. And secondly, when he had elections, he made a huge strategic error by disallowing the PPP and Nawaz Sharif's party from really participating, which allowed these religious parties that I talked about earlier to come to the fore. These religious parties were getting 2% of the vote, and they now get like 15% of the vote. So I think Musharraf has made some serious mistakes, but he remains our best hope.
Back? Yes, sir.
Dennis Cook from the Wilson Center. In your talk, you took a bit of a swipe at the intelligence agency's acumen in finding Philadelphia. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize to Ambassador Cox for anything unfortunate I might have said about Pakistan. But no. I think the fact that we had no one in Iraq kind of speaks for itself. The fact that it just seems that we're very poorly served by our intelligence agencies. I mean, individually there are a lot of great people. Bruce Hoffman and I are great admirers of Mike Scheuer and also his book about Bin Laden. Scheuer lost his job as head of the Bin Laden unit because he was, quote, too anti-Bin Laden, which is fairly astonishing. So I think that historically we've not done very well. Is that being improved? I don't know. I mean, I think Rael Garek wrote a great piece just before 9/11 about this kind of cultural thing about it's very hard to find people who live in Northern Virginia to go and do the sorts of things that might actually be required. And if you go to any American embassy, as I'm sure most of the people in this room know, it's very hard for people in the embassy to leave the building and forget about going and actually meeting with dubious characters. So I think there's a meeting going on right now about how we reorganize the American intelligence apparatus. The press conference going on upstairs. But I think that there is really a more profound cultural problem that has to be addressed. And I think part of it is class. This may be an unpopular thing to say, but I think the kinds of people who joined the agency in the 50s, the Kermit Roosevelts, whether we agreed with them or disagreed with them, were incredibly effective. I mean, they were overthrowing people we didn't like all around the world with some success. And I don't think the agency is attracting these kinds of people who actually speak. In Bob Baer's book is amazing. Bob Baer's first book, the Paris station chief didn't speak French. I mean, how difficult is that? So I think that it's really a complete cultural change. If we're really being serious about penetrating or even getting close to penetrating these groups, I think we need to recruit very different kinds of people. I don't see that's happening.
On one hand, and on the other hand, we have this new policy of promoting democracy in the region and this freedom, and that seems to be the elder strategy. What's your assessment on the depth of the traction this is going to get to buy away those people that need you so important to life?
Well, I mean, the question of democratization in the region, I think the United States has to have a serious discussion about what we actually intend. It's not widely remembered in this country about what happened in the Algerian elections back in 1990, where we sort of stood by when there was a free and fair election in Algeria. The army basically annulled it, and then there was a civil war. and we sort of stood by. And if we do that again, I don't think in any shape or form, in any election in the Middle East, I think our credibility will not be helped. So I think that if we are serious about democratization in the Middle East, we're going to have to also be serious with the realization that these regimes are going to be more anti-Israeli and very possibly more anti-American than the present ones. And is that, in my view, that's not, that will change over time. Certainly, more democratic regimes would allow the political space for the Al-Qaeda to go out of business. It's not a coincidence that so many Saudis and Egyptians are part of this group where there's no political space to go anywhere else. I think that's one thing. But I think that if we are serious about this democratization, we have to also sort of live with the consequences of what that might bring.
Why don't we take one final question?
Retired service officer. With the change in the organization of the structure and operating style of Al-Qaeda since 9/11 that you've described here, do you also see changes in the way Al-Qaeda is getting funds and allocating those funds?
Terrorism is a very cheap form of warfare. When Ramzi Youssef tried to blow up the World Trade Center on the first occasion, it cost maybe $10,000. As I pointed out earlier, the $500,000 for 9/11 was this enormously successful leverage investment. So I've always been very kind of skeptical about this whole money thing. The Treasury Department often releases things, we've shut down $171 million in these accounts and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. I remember President Clinton saying all these same things after the embassy bombings without obviously much effect. So I think that the money is very useful as an investigative tool, but it's not useful as a preventative tool. Shutting down the sources of money, I think, is largely a feel-good exercise, because basically you can't buy people willing to martyr themselves. You can't get 19 young guys to fly passenger jets into large buildings because of money. It's really not about that. Of course, everything you can do is useful, but I think money plays a relatively small role in this organization. What really plays a very large role is belief, and I think that's something that a lot of people have a lot of problems either understanding with or dealing with. And so how do we undermine these beliefs is really more important than how do we shut down the money supply.
Well, we've been really treated to an amazing tour d'horizon of the status of Al-Qaeda. This series will resume in the new year. Stand by for announcement about our future meetings. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Peter Bergen for an excellent presentation.
I didn't know you had a question for us. I didn't quite understand. So I'm wondering whether the whole idea of criminal freedom is that going to have traction? What I call the I guess it was serious about it. I believe it's called that's great. So you and Mike Sawyer, when you joined this, did you work for you? Whatever I Thank you very much.
Everything was done. Thank you. Thank you. No, I really don't. I don't answer questions I don't know the answer to. So I just don't. I just don't know. I don't really have any feelings. So, generous. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, one way or the other. I mean, it's not clear to everybody.
Do you know if this book is being given out? They've done two, or is that something?
Yes, they get them out.
They give them out?
how did the gentleman respond to you who was sitting right there in front of Peter Bergen?
He said okay.
He never moved. But I mean, he kind of just slid to the side, which basically I wanted him knocking out of the way so I could just capture, you know, his frame. But at one point he was cutting off the whole side of his face.
Yeah, I went back upstairs and looked at the webcast. Sorry.
He said okay, and he said. We can't wait for him to get out. You know, it's
He can't wait to go home and say I'm on TV.
Too bad we just got the back of it.
Big round gold spot.
We didn't get to see your face.
He stood up at one point.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you can claim it. Yeah.
It's so scary.
Yeah.
Bad.
I mean, it just goes with the territory. He deals with a lot of prima donnas when it comes to that. But after you leave and you come in, this is not a restaurant, you know. Go to stop out, check it, right in the back of the room. You know, I guess like the people who actually do the function or whatever, who work here, they don't want to make this film, but I'll make it national anyway. As you leave, would you please take your plates and all your resources on your way out? That way, I mean, come on now. I mean,
you're getting
they should know better. They should know better than just to dump it. I mean, even when I know somebody's cleaning it up, I still do that. So what makes them any different? Last I checked, most of them didn't grow up with servants here in America.
Exactly.
Okay? I grew up outside the country with servants. I still don't do that. So if I don't do that, I don't expect them to do that. Now, who do you think people actually get paid to clean up after you? Common courtesy. Some of the same people who were here at the center, I saw them leaving things behind too. Like it's contagious.
They got to find someone else to do it. Because, yeah.
On this lunch, huh? Oh, man.
Yeah.
I thought they were going all the way to 2.
No, it isn't. 1:30.
Yeah.
You
Oh, yeah?
the water is fine. Oh, you want?
No. Yeah, you didn't come down from y'all. What's that? No. Yeah, that's all. Have you seen the spring cake? The one with the, you got it? All the stuff goes on here. Right. Are you doing any more filming today or that's it? Okay. Ain't actually doing that anymore. It don't matter to me, brother. Easy day with you. They said they got 2 women upstairs. What you film, what you gonna do then? You not saying that? They gonna say we get one more? I need more, I didn't say it now. I didn't say to ask no question. I was just saying producing it, I just shoot. No, actually, I have my own company and I do subcontract work.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's what everybody's saying. Why don't you just work here? I'm like, oh, because you all won't pay me enough. And they're like, oh, okay.